Christian said he'd be happy to answer any questions anyone might have, and he's going to give them back to you in exactly the same words, but in a slightly different order.
Yes, if you have any questions or concerns about tonight's reading, please feel free to put up your hand. I'm actually very good at these inquisitions. Historically, science and poetry have been regarded as discursive opposites. Science is everything that poetry is not, and poetry is everything that science is not. Ever since probably the Romantic era, if not before, metaphor has been greeted suspiciously by the discourses of truth. And science is no different from this. I mean, you're not supposed to be able to deploy metaphor in the course of trying to explain the world. Now, of course, science enjoys tremendous prestige as a discourse of truth, whereas, of course, before the scientific era, poetry enjoyed the prestige of being the discourse of truth. That is not, of course, the case now. I mean, poetry is, in some sense, consigned to recounting, I don't know, lyrical anecdotes about divorces and, other trivia of daily life now. And to my dismay, poets aren't responding to what I think is probably the most important cultural activity that we do as a species. Science is probably the most important thing that we do. It probably will guarantee or otherwise threaten our survival as a species, will get us out of many fixes. It's probably the most important thing that we're doing, second only perhaps to the economy. We've probably been able to exert control over the entire planet almost entirely due to science, not due to poetry. Now, to me, this is worrisome that poets don't respond very adequately to the milieu of science, to its discursive character. Granted, science is hard, and poets have been demoted to this job, in part because, if they could do something else, they would do that, right? Right. I never tell my students, write what you know, because they know nothing, right? If they knew something, they'd be in that discipline, right? They'd be actually doing that, right? Instead, poetry seems like the great holdout of, the uninformed and the failed, right? It's like, a great place to go if you've got no other choice, right? Because there's great tolerance for failure, and I don't know, my friend Kenny Goldsmith describes poetry. His definition of poetry is flypaper for fuck-ups. Right? Now, granted, that's a harsh definition. I agree, it's a harsh definition. My presumption is that I think I want to be a 21st century poet, and that implies that I have to actually respond, in some respects, to the sociological or technological conditions of my writing life. And it seems to me that that's an unexplored terrain. The world of science is relatively open for poets to colonize, because nobody else is going to do so. And I suppose I'm dismayed, for example, that we've put a human being on the moon. Astronauts wandered around the moon, and that is probably the greatest achievement of any life form that has ever evolved on this planet, to actually deliberately go to another world. And yet, despite this tremendous achievement, the fact that many of us in this room are probably alive and can remember the astronaut actually stepping off the ladder onto the lunar surface, it's my first memory that I can actually date. It's like being alive when a lungfish has crawled out of the ocean and strode on the land. It's an important evolutionary moment in the history of life on this planet. And yet poets have not yet written a canonically important epic poem about this event. Whereas I think if the ancient Greeks had rowed a trireme to the moon, you can bet there'd be a 12-volume epic about that, right? Right? It's kind of mystifying to me, right? That the great work of Western literature, of course, is let's go rescue the kidnapped fishwife, right? And you've got intercontinental battles and extraterrestrial voyages that would rival the mythic character of the greatest works of poetry that in fact founded civilizations, right? Poetry nowadays, I don't think aspires to found a civilization. And I think I would like to be able to do that, but I don't think I can without accessing a catechism of training far outside my literary expertise. I have to somehow learn how to be something else. I've got to program a computer. I've got to become a biochemist. I've got to, become an architect or something else. I've got to learn how to do something else in an effort to actually extract from that its sorcery, right, in order to be able to, I think, to be the best poet I can be in the 21st century. So that's why science appears very predominantly in these works. It's in part because it's an uncolonized vocabulary. It's a lexicon that's ripe for the plucking, if only somebody was willing to exploit it. And we live in a scientific era, so I think I'm trying to respond adequately to the conditions under which we find ourselves in the 21st century. I hope that lengthy, somewhat verbose answer is adequate. Thank you so much. Anyway. Well, you see, I probably prefer looking at the papers produced by scientists because, of course, those are absolutely extravagant, speculative, imaginative texts that are crazy in their use of language. I mean, it's a really strange milieu. I mean, I became a poet in part because I wanted to be the most imaginative person in the room. But, particle physicists and theoretical physicists really are crazier than that, right? And to me, this is an important feature, I think, of modern life, is that in some respects the physicists get to think in the most radical way. I mean, they truly are the avant-garde of thought and concept, right? Certainly, I take a lay interest in that milieu. Of course, I'm trying to exploit the richest vocabulary that I can muster. I mean, English has an extraordinarily lush lexicon, and I suppose what vexes me, really irritates me about a lot of contemporary poetry is that I pick up the book and I look at it and I've seen all these words before, just not in that order, right? I mean, I've seen all these words before, love, river, bones, etc. You name the words. I mean, there's lots of words for which there should be some sort of moratorium, right? Yet they recur with an implausible frequency. I mean, why are poets not bored enough, right, to go exploring, right? I mean, they should be really picking up, mathematical papers, right? With all these, extremely deranged, lexicons, right? Beautiful poetry, and of course, the physicists I imagine are trying to encapsulate in the human brain, ideas which are probably larger than we've evolved to, accommodate, right? And have to reach, towards this kind of poetic diction to somehow frame what they do, right? I mean, they have to go to, Faginian's Wake to find something bizarre enough, right, to name something as weird as a quark, right? I think that it's compelling for me just to imagine extracting, mining, the rich vein of scientific endeavor, and in part because it's fascinating, it's interesting, and to me seems to me an important part of the human condition, somewhat ignored by poets. Well, much of my work is, I suppose, inspired by pastiches of scientific writing. My doctoral dissertation was on the subject of Pathophysics, the whimsical philosophy created by Alfred Jarry at the turn of the last century, a kind of poetic critique of science, while at the same time being a scientific critique of poetry. And it tries to, I suppose, parody the discursive character of the scientist, simply by proposing irrational axioms and then logically and very rigorously showcasing the outcome of those ideas, right? So when people ask me, what do you mean by pataphysics? What constitutes a pataphysical concept? I would say, okay, well, imagine that if you drop a cat from a sufficient height, it always lands on its 4 feet, right? It always lands on its feet. That's folkloric, right? We understand that is somehow true, right? And of course, if we drop a buttered slice of toast from a sufficient height, it always lands butter side down, right? These are kind of folkloric, bits of knowledge that we've just accumulated. Let's imagine that these are in fact axioms of physics, right? It would therefore, perforce, be true that we could create perpetual motion machines by tying to the back of a cat a slice of toast butter side out, right? And then dropping it from a sufficient height, right? Then you'd have this kind of dynamo, right? That would just, the energy crisis solved, right? And in some universe, that's going to be true, okay? Right? There's some universe in the grand multiverse where that is true, where, dropping cats, is in fact a law of physics, right? Right? And that's pataphysics. So hence I appreciate the pastiche of, science that characterizes some of the, Perec's imagination. I mean, I like Oulipo in part because of their, it's populated by mathematicians, and I probably have an OCD mathematical sensibility to my own practice. My own, brain is infected by these kinds of viruses, and as a consequence, I'm very curious about those ideas, because in part because they just seem very productive for poetry, right? There's all kinds of beautiful mathematical structures and forms. Like I would just love someday to be able to write a poem that's structurally equivalent to the Calabi, Yao manifold or something like that, right? It would be lovely to have, some sort of, representation of, the string theory, just embodied in a poem structurally, mathematically. It'd be lovely, but those have to wait until I finish this, project. I want to try to build this unkillable bacterium. I've trained myself to be a molecular biochemist, and built a gene sequence, did the genetic engineering myself, did all the genetic design such that a poem enciphered in this gene would be effectively misinterpreted or translated by the organism as a set of instructions for building a protein. And I had to design that gene sequence so that the protein that it produced would be in fact viable enough to persist in the cell and ensconce a poem in its own sequence of amino acids. So I've had to learn how to become a proteomic engineer and a genetic engineer to do this project, albeit, this is a very dilettantish set of skills. That's all I know how to do, right? In this, don't expect me to pipette anything in a lab, okay? The fact is the scientists that I collaborate are not willing to do any design for me, and they won't solve my problems, but they are happy to make things for me. I can go to them, I can say, can you please make this? And they're happy to test things. I say, I've got an assay I'd like you to run. They're happy to do that. But if things go awry, or if there are problems with this project, they don't solve them for me, and they certainly don't participate in the design. They're unwilling to invest any time in that kind of activity. Hey, they're curing cancer, right? So I've ground my own pigment, so to speak. I've had to learn a whole set of skills that enable me to use genetic engineering as a medium, right? To use DNA as a potential poetic medium. And it just seems to me that if I don't finish this project soon enough, some high school kid somewhere is actually going to beat me to it, right? Yeah. The fact is that rebuilding the genome of an organism is probably not much more difficult than hacking a computer. I think a high school education and with access to the internet and maybe a few $1,000s of machinery and perhaps some spending money is sufficient to conduct these kinds of experiments in your own home, in your own garage. Basically, I'm kind of done the poetic equivalent of building a meth lab, right? And, in my own home, right? And then try to design my own drugs, right? That's kind of what poetry is, right? It's, designer meth, right? For the mind, right? I hope that answer was satisfactory. I don't write poetry. I build, anti-grav machines out of words. I think that's what I'm there. I'm very, at Area 51, reverse engineering some alien technology called language and trying to make it, usable by human beings. All right. Any other questions? Please don't feel intimidated. You should just put up your hand if you've got some concern. A query? Have I exhausted your interest now? All right. You've been very sweet. Thank you for putting up with me. Okay, let's go get drunk. Okay, thank you very kindly. All right, you've been very, very gracious. Thanks a lot.